Phil never believed in ghost stories, but as he stood at the edge of Black Hollow Forest, he couldn't shake the eerie feeling in his gut. There was something terribly wrong here. Chris had heard gossip about Black Hollow Forest, the mysterious patch of woods on the outskirts of town that no one dared to venture into. People in town avoided it like the plague. Warning stories passed down about those who had entered never returning the same or not returning at all. For some, it was nothing more than superstition. For Chris, it was an invitation to prove that such things were just stories. And who better to join him than his closest friends? It wasn't just the oppressive silence in that forest that smothered the air, or the dense fog that wrapped around the trees like giant ghosts. No, it was the trees themselves. Their twisted, knotted trunks seemed to reach out to him, their branches curling into grotesque shapes as if clawing for something, or someone. Claire shuddered beside him, her face pale. "This place feels," she faltered, her voice barely above a whisper, "like it's watching us." Jake rolled his eyes, attempting to mask his unease. "It's just a forest, Claire. You're letting those dumb stories get to you." Mona wrapped her arms tightly around her body, her lips trembling. "Let's just get this over with." Chris, the only one of them who seemed eager, flashed them a grin. "You know, there's an old legend about this place," he said as they began walking into the forest. "People say once you step in, the forest never lets you leave." Phil scoffed. "Yeah, and how did the people telling those stories get out, huh?" Chris gave him a crooked smile, his eyes gleaming with something darker. "Maybe they never did." The words hung in the air, thick and ominous. Then, somewhere deep in the shadows of the trees, there was a whisper. At first, Phil thought it was just the wind, the way it rustled through the leaves. But no, it was far too clear. It said his name. With each step deeper into the forest, Phil felt the weight of the place pressing down on him. The air grew thick as if it was made of something tangible, something alive. The trees, once scattered, were now packed together in twisted formations, their thick trunks rubbing against one another like the bones of some giant ancient creature. The branches above them twisted like skeletal hands, their long, sharp fingers nearly touching the ground. The sunlight that had filtered through the canopy faded quickly, and it wasn't long before the only light was from the weak beams of their flashlights cutting through the growing gloom. The forest felt unnatural, alive. The minutes turned to hours. They came across an old clearing, a place marked on the map where they could camp. But when they arrived, it was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The ground was too smooth, unnaturally flat. It was bare. No grass, no leaves, and no evidence of life. It was as if something had come through and wiped it clean. Chris dropped his backpack with a grin. "This is perfect. Let's set up camp." Claire's face twisted with discomfort. "I don't like it here. It feels wrong." "Oh, come on," Chris urged, unfazed. "Don't tell me you're scared now." Phil forced a laugh, the unease crawling up his spine. "Let's just build the fire." As night fell, the silence that had settled over them was not just the absence of sound. It was oppressive. It pressed down on them, heavy and watchful. Something was listening. Then, suddenly, Chris stood up, his movement jerky. "I need to pee," he said, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the trees. A minute passed, then 5, then 10. "Chris?" Claire called, her voice laced with concern. No answer. Phil's chest tightened. Something was wrong. He grabbed his flashlight and started searching for him, his footsteps loud in the quiet. The beam of light barely seemed to cut through the darkness. "Chris?" Nothing. Then, just ahead, something moved. It wasn't Chris. It was a shadow, a dark shape, standing at the edge of the trees. Phil's heart raced, but there was no mistaking it. Chris was standing there. Except, no. Something was wrong. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his body stiff and unresponsive. His arms hung like limp, dead weight at his sides, and his eyes were gone. Phil took a step forward, his breath caught in his throat. The air seemed to hum, like static crackling from an unseen source. Then, Chris's face rippled. It wasn't a normal movement. It was like something was trying to break free from underneath. His skin shuddered as though whatever had been pretending to be him was struggling, contorting. Phil gasped, taking a step back. Chris's body twitched, and then he was gone, vanished, like he had never been there at all. Phil stumbled backward, his mind racing. His feet moved before his brain could process it, and he ran. The air around him seemed to close in. The whole forest felt like it was shifting, rearranging themselves to trap him. When Phil finally made it back to the camp, his friends looked up in shock. "Where's Chris?" Mona asked, her voice tight with worry. Phil's throat was dry. "He's gone. I saw him, but it wasn't him. It was like something else, something wearing his skin." Claire's face went pale. "We need to leave. Now." They grabbed their things, their movements frantic. But when they turned to go, they froze. The path was gone. The trees had shifted. They were surrounded by thick, oppressive foliage, too thick, too close. "This isn't possible," Jake muttered, his voice trembling. Then the whispering began. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. Chris's voice. "Come back." Mona clamped her hands over her ears. Shut up, don't listen." "Run," Claire gasped. "We need to run." They didn't think, they just moved. They sprinted through the forest, branches swiping at their faces, roots tangling at their feet, the ground itself shifting beneath them. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like it was coming from the trees themselves. And then, Mona screamed. Phil turned just in time to see her dissolve into the shadows. No traces of her. She just disappeared, swallowed by the night. The whispering laughed. "Almost home," it crooned. They ran until their legs burned and their lungs felt like they were on fire. And then, suddenly, they found themselves back in the clearing. But it wasn't their camp anymore. No, it was already set up. Their tents, their fire, their footprints. It was impossible. Claire staggered back, her breathing shallow. No, this isn't real." Jake collapsed to his knees, panting. "We're going in circles." A crackling sound came from the trees behind them. Phil turned his flashlight toward the noise, and there it was, watching. A shape, thin and tall, too tall. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, bending at impossible angles. It was moving toward them, its form stretching and warping with each step. And its face? Well, it didn't have one. But Phil knew it was smiling. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. Claire whispered, trembling. "We need to go, now." But the thing stepped forward, and with it, the trees moved. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hunting them. The ground shifted beneath their feet. Branches cracked like thunder. The earth itself seemed to tremble as if the forest was awakening. Roots shot up from the ground, twisting like massive, pale hands, reaching for them. Jake tripped. "Help!" he cried, his voice cracking. Phil reached out, grabbing his arm. "Get up!" he yelled. But then something else moved beneath them. A pale, long hand shot from the ground, its fingers like icy claws, and grabbed Jake's ankle. Jake screamed. It was a sound of pure terror, high and shrill. "No!" Phil shouted, but it was too late. Jake was pulled under. There was no struggle, no fight. He just vanished, swallowed whole by the earth. Phil dug his fingers into the dirt, but it was useless. The forest was stronger. Jake's fingers slipped from his grasp, and in the blink of an eye, he was gone. They could hear the same whisper again, and Phil knew they were next. There was no escape. No matter how far they ran, no matter which way they turned, they always ended up back in the same place, back in the clearing, back where they started. Claire's breath hitched. There's no way out. The fire had burned down to embers, their footprints multiplying. They had been here before, again and again. Claire stopped breathing. Phil turned to look. Her eyes were wide, frozen in fear. She was staring at something behind him. Slowly, he turned. It was there. The thing. It was standing right behind him. It had Claire's face, but it wasn't Claire. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide into a grin that shouldn't have been human. Its eyes were empty voids, and it whispered, "You were always meant to stay." The fire flickered, its last breath of light sputtering out. Darkness swallowed them, and Phil felt that the forest took him. The search for them began the next morning. The town rallied, but no one ever found them. The next group to step into Black Hollow Forest, though, saw something chilling. 5 sets of footprints. Leading in, none leading out. And deep within the trees, the whispering started again, calling for the next ones.